For more insight into the key takeaways from the G20 summit, joining us now is Vikram Nehru. He's a senior fellow from the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Vikram, thank you so much for joining us. Firstly, India's emphasis on inclusive growth and support for the developing world was evident at the G20 summit. How pivotal was this year's gathering for the global South countries that he championed?
Well, I think only time will tell. The agenda and the declaration of the G20 squarely focused on developing country issues and the issues of the global South. There was, as you've already mentioned in your lead up to this, concerns about food security, about war in the Ukraine and its implications for global stability, about reforming the multilateral global institutions, terrorism, financial stability, and so on. So clearly the agenda and the declaration focused very much on the challenges of the global South. So to that extent, I think it's an extremely important event. The problem with the G20, however, is the big gap between rhetoric and global reality. And I think only time will tell as to whether many of the aspirational goals put forward by the G20 in their declaration will actually be fulfilled. We'll have to wait and see.
I just want to get your quick thought on the term Global South, given it's not strictly geographical. And also, as host of the G20, what do you make of India's credentials as a bridge between the Global South countries and the West?
Well, I think you were spot on. The Global South is really a euphemism for all low and middle income countries as defined by the World Bank. So these are developing countries which are largely receivers of aid from global international institutions as well as from bilateral institutions. And most of them are in, as you point out, the Southern Hemisphere, certainly south of many of the advanced economies in the world. So in that sense, I thought you correctly pointed out what exactly the Global South consisted of. Is India a representative or a voice for the Global South? It certainly is portraying itself as one. I'm not so sure that it necessarily speaks for all members of the Global South. But India has been a very important voice, which has always been, traditionally been non-aligned, along with countries in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, as well as some countries in Africa. So India is certainly an important voice. Whether it's a pivotal voice, whether it's the most important voice, I'm not so sure about that. Again, I guess time will tell. One must remember that the chair of the G20 is a rotational chair. It's really a symbolic position. So just because India was the chair of the G20 this year doesn't necessarily make it the voice of the Global South. Having said that, I think India must be credited for having an agenda which is squarely on global development issues, point number one. Point number two, India pushed and succeeded in having the African Union become a permanent member of the G20. I think that's a really, really good and important outcome. And thirdly, at the end of the G20 meeting, there was an announcement of a mega infrastructure corridor between India, the Middle East, and Europe, which will have important implications for South Asia, which is one of the very important parts of the Global South.
Let's then talk about the African Union having made it that permanent member of G20, Vikram. What implications will the inclusion have for the group's dynamics and future economic discussions?
Well, it's very ironic, isn't it, that for all these years, ever since the G20 came into existence, we've had the European Union as a part of the G20. There are actually 19 countries in the G20, and the 20th member of the G20 is the European Union. And this is a very asymmetrical arrangement in favor of the richer countries of the world. And I think having the African Union become a permanent member brings it to balance some of the voice of the Global South. So in that sense, it's a very important development. Secondly, I think increasingly the African continent is going to become a very important player in global issues. It is, after all, one of the largest commodity producers in the world. There is enormous competition between China and the West in Africa to influence the outcome of what's going on in that continent. And it's becoming increasingly pivotal as a supplier, by the way, of rare earths and rare metals, which are going to be critical in the future of the electric vehicle industry, in the future of the digital economy that is rapidly expanding around the world. And both China as well as the West are keenly aware of this.
It's not just about who was there at the G20, also about who wasn't. And what did you make of the absence of China's President Xi Jinping? Although President Vladimir Putin also not present, but that one perhaps a bit more understandable. Do you think it was a bid to sidestep uncomfortable conversations or done with strategic intent with regards to China's president?
Well, there were no official explanations as to why President Xi decided not to come to the G20 summit. There's been a lot of speculation. One of them is exactly as you point out, that there were uncomfortable issues which he may have had to confront. China has just issued a map of China, which includes parts of India in it, which also includes Taiwan as part of it, and the South China Sea. So this clearly has led to outrage amongst many of the countries affected, including India. And I think it could be that President Xi's cancellation of his visit was a response to the Indian expression of anger. That could be one reason, but there could be others. For example, just before the G20, there was the BRICS meeting in South Africa, and there was an expansion of the BRICS. This is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, part of the BRICS group, but this BRICS group has now been expanded to include a lot of other countries. And the impression given of that expansion of membership is that this is becoming to be more of a China-centric group, and developing positions that are more anti-Western in nature. And I think China not attending the G20 could have been providing a message that they wanted to distance themselves slightly from the G20 and align themselves more with this expanded BRICS group and present it more as a voice, again, of those that perhaps oppose some of the policies of the West. Lastly, I think it could be said that, it could perhaps just be that President Xi was not well. When he was in the BRICS meeting, he canceled his keynote address. He clearly looked ill and tired, so it's possible that he just wasn't well and decided not to attend. We just don't know.
All right, Vikram, well, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. Vikram Nehru, a senior fellow from the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University.